The cowboy sneak-kicked into an Apache shelter, unaware it was the chief's daughter's shelter. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The desert between Arizona and New Mexico was known for its extremes. By late autumn 1881, the days were long and hot, the nights brutally cold, and men who traveled it alone often carried more scars than provisions. Matthias Cole knew this too well. He had been riding west for 2 weeks, keeping to himself, avoiding towns when he could. His horse had gone lame 3 days earlier, forcing him to finish on foot, and the long silence of the land had begun to press on him heavier than he wanted to admit. Matthias was 39 years old, shoulders broad from years of ranch work, his face worn by weather and grief alike. His wife and son had died of fever back in Texas 3 winters ago, and since then he had carried solitude like a second skin. He no longer thought of himself as a man with a future. He worked odd jobs, drifted between settlements, and kept moving when the weight of memory grew too sharp. That night, when the sun bled out behind the ridges and the air turned bitter, he realized he had miscalculated the distance to shelter. He needed cover before cold set in hard. The outline of a dug-in structure caught his eye at the base of a ridge. Brush piled high, timbers pressed into stone. It looked like something made to last just long enough, not permanent. He crouched and studied it, listening. No sound carried from inside. He pushed through the brush anyway, thinking only of fire and a roof. The moment he stepped inside, he knew he was not alone. A woman sat near the back wall, the glow of low coals showing her clearly. Bronze-skinned, young but hardened, with long black hair braided loose and decorated with feathers and beads. Her deerskin dress clung to her body, decorated with shells and careful stitching, but the neckline had torn on one side, leaving her cleavage partly visible in a way that looked more vulnerable than deliberate. Dirt and travel had marked her, but she held herself upright, sharp eyes locked on him. In her hand, a knife, small but steady, aimed in his direction. Matthias froze. He raised both palms, open. His voice came quiet, hoarse from days without use. "Didn't know it was yours." Her eyes narrowed. Her breathing quickened, but she didn't move or answer. He slid the hat from his head, laid it on the ground slowly, and lowered himself to sit against the wall near the entrance. He wanted her to see he wasn't going to lunge, wasn't going to corner her. His heartbeat thudded heavy in his chest, the old soldier's instinct reminding him how quick things could turn violent. He had been in enough standoffs to know how one wrong twitch could mean the end. His mind calculated the distance between them, the reach of her knife, and the rifle at his own side. He forced himself to sit still, showing nothing but restraint. The shelter groaned under the push of wind. A beam sagged overhead. He watched it lean further, judged that if it gave way, both of them would be in the open again. Slowly he stood. Her grip on the knife tightened, the blade trembling though her arms stayed firm. He raised a hand in her direction, signaling his intent, then stepped outside into the cold. Her pulse beat hard in her throat. She thought he was leaving. Good, she told herself. Yet when minutes passed and he returned with 2 sturdy branches, her knife did not lower. He pressed the wood against the beam, wedged it steady until the frame no longer creaked. He did it without speaking, without glancing at her, and then sat back down by the door. For the first time, her expression shifted. Confusion crossed her eyes, edged with suspicion. Why would a stranger bother strengthening her roof instead of taking her space? Matthias dug into his coat pocket, pulled out a strip of dried meat. He placed it on the ground between them. His hands shook slightly from hunger, but he leaned back again, letting her decide. She studied it. Her stomach nodded, but she fought not to show it. He had intruded, yes, but he had not advanced. He had not laughed, shouted, or reached for her. She slowly bent forward, picked up the meat, and chewed. All the while her eyes stayed fixed on him, measuring him. Inside her chest, her heart pounded as fast as his. She had been running for weeks, scattered with what was left of her people after soldiers raided their camp. Her name was Ayoka, daughter of a chief, though titles no longer gave her protection. She had lived on the edge of hunger, hiding in gullies and abandoned places, never knowing which stranger might be her end. Every man she had crossed paths with since had looked at her body before her face. She expected this one to be no different, but he had set his hat down. He had reinforced her shelter. He had offered food and distance. She didn't lower the knife, but she no longer pressed it forward either. Her voice came, thin and broken, but steady enough. "You name?" Matthias met her gaze. His throat felt tight, but he answered, "Matthias Cole." Silence stretched. Finally, she whispered back, "Ayoka." The name lingered between them. He gave a slow nod, the kind that meant he would remember it. Then he leaned his head back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at him, but he did not close his eyes fully. He knew better than to sleep deeply with a knife so close. Her chest rose and fell quickly, nerves still sharp. But beneath it, she felt the strange calm of not being alone. It unsettled her more than the knife in her hand. Outside, the wind shoved harder, rattling the brush wall, but the new beams held firm. Inside, the fire burned low, and the shelter held two people who had no reason to trust one another. Yet neither had chosen to leave. Matthias' thoughts turned to the locket in his pocket, the one he had not opened since his family's burial. Ayoka's hand tightened on the leather pouch tied to her dress, the last beads from her father. Both carried tokens of lives gone, proof of love they had lost. Neither spoke of it, not yet. The night dragged forward, each hour heavy with silence. But for the first time in months for both of them, they were not facing it alone. The night wore itself out slow, and when the first light pressed through the seams of the shelter, Matthias opened his eyes to see Ayoka still sitting upright near the fire. Her knife rested across her lap, though her grip had loosened. She had not allowed herself sleep, not fully, but her head had dipped once or twice, braids sliding forward over her shoulder. Matthias stayed still for a moment, studying her in the gray half-light. She was young, too young, he thought, to carry so much weight in her eyes. He wondered how long she had been living in this hollow, how many nights she had endured the desert wind alone. When he shifted, the boards beneath him creaked, and her head lifted instantly. Her eyes found his, sharp again, and her hand tightened on the knife. He raised one palm slow. "Just getting up," he said, his voice quiet. She didn't lower the blade, but she didn't lunge either. Matthias ducked outside, the cold biting his face. The ridge cut the wind some, but the desert stretched flat and merciless in every direction. No smoke rose from any camp, no sound of men or horses nearby. He crouched and studied the earth, tracks faint but present, old boot marks leading west. He guessed a week or more since anyone else had been near. That answered one of his questions. Whoever had scattered her people was long gone, but she remained, tucked away and waiting for something that might never come. When he re-entered, she watched him closely, suspicion unbroken. He settled back near the entrance, stretching his sore shoulders, and broke the silence. "You alone here?" Her face hardened at the words. She looked down, touched the small leather pouch tied to her dress, then nodded once. Her lips pressed thin, and he understood she had no one left within reach. The fire had burned low, so he fed it with a stick from the pile he had seen in the corner. Sparks lifted, warming the space again. He thought about offering more food, but his supply was nearly gone. The truth was, he hadn't planned to share with anyone. Still, he dug into his pack and pulled another strip of meat. This time, he placed it closer to her side. She didn't reach it first. Her dark eyes moved from the food to his face. "Why?" she asked in halting English. Matthias drew a breath, choosing plain words. "Because you need it." He didn't add that he needed it too. He didn't say he hadn't thought about keeping it for himself. He figured honesty didn't need to be loud. She hesitated, then took it, chewing slow. Her hand brushed the torn seam at her neckline, as if aware of how much her body showed in the firelight. She tugged the dress upward, but the damage left too much exposed. Matthias forced his eyes to the fire instead of her chest. He felt the urge to explain himself, why he hadn't looked too long, why he kept distance, but words didn't come easy. Instead, He busied himself with his gear, pulling his rifle into his lap, checking the chamber. Not to threaten her, just to show his routine, that he was a man who maintained his tools. Her gaze lingered on him, measuring. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both pride and weariness. "You not soldier?" Matthias paused, then shook his head. "Was long ago. Not anymore." She tilted her head, her braid sliding forward. "You kill Apache?" The question tightened his chest. He thought of the border fights he had witnessed years back, the skirmishes where men with rifles had treated tribes like game. He had not pulled the trigger in those fights, but he had stood nearby, part of the same machine, and it left him no cleaner than the rest. He looked at her directly. "No, not me." The answer hung between them, thin but heavy. She studied him a long moment, and though her eyes stayed wary, something in her shoulders eased. The morning stretched on with silence, broken only by the crack of wood in the fire. Matthias patched a split in the brush wall with branches he cut from outside. Ayoka watched, her knife still near, but her hands now busy smoothing the beadwork on her dress, as though reminding herself of who she was before exile. By midday, the questions most listeners would have asked, the ones Matthias himself had held back, came to the surface. Why was she alone? Why had she not left when the chance came? She gave the answers in fragments, her English broken but clear enough. Soldiers had come to her camp, men on horses carrying rifles. Her father, a chief, had told her to run. She had done as he said. Since then, she had not seen him or her family. "Maybe dead," she said flatly, though her hand tightened around the leather pouch at her side. The beads inside clinked softly when she touched them, proof she still hoped. Matthias listened without interrupting. He knew what it was to bury family, to stand alone afterward. For a moment, he considered telling her about the graves in Texas the wife and child fever had taken, but he swallowed the words. His pain was not hers to carry. Instead, he nodded toward the ridge. "You'll freeze if you stay here long." Her jaw set. "Where go?" He had no answer. He hadn't planned farther than surviving the night himself. He thought about heading north, where work on ranches still existed. He thought about leaving her to choose her own way. But as he looked at her, knife in hand, dress torn, eyes sharp but tired, he knew the desert would finish her before long. "We'll figure that after," he said. Her eyes searched his, testing whether his words meant what they sounded like. Then she looked away, as if giving him no answer was safer than trusting too soon. The day passed slow. He worked on the shelter. She prepared strips of dried mesquite bark to keep the fire alive. They spoke little, but every gesture filled the silence. When his hand brushed hers while passing a piece of wood, she didn't pull back right away. For Matthias, that felt louder than any promise she could have given. By evening, the wind rose again, whistling through cracks in the brush wall. The cold pressed hard, and the fire could not push it back fully. Matthias sat close to the entrance, arms folded against his chest, eyes half shut. Ayoka shifted nearer to the coals, her torn dress slipping down one shoulder. She glanced at him once, then drew her blanket tighter. He thought of moving closer, offering his coat, but he stayed still. He knew trust wasn't something you rushed, not after what she had been through. Still, when her eyes closed for the first time, knife slipping from her fingers, he realized she had chosen sleep in his presence. That trust, however fragile, settled heavier in him than the cold. Matthias leaned back against the wall, letting the fire warm his boots. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The fire had burned to gray ash by morning, and when Matthias stirred, his first sight was of Ayoka still asleep beside it. She had drawn her blanket high around her shoulders, her braid loose, her face softened by rest in a way he hadn't yet seen. The knife she always kept close had slipped from her hand during the night, lying across the dirt near her hip. For the first time since he had stepped into that shelter, she looked less like a sentry and more like a woman who had not closed her eyes for too many nights. Matthias didn't move right away. He let his thoughts wander in silence, weighing choices. He had come west not chasing land or work, but to escape memories. His wife's fever, his son's short breath, the graves he had left behind under a crooked oak in Texas. He had no plan beyond surviving. Yet here he was inside a shelter that wasn't his, sitting across from a woman who had lost as much as he had, maybe more. He wondered what he was supposed to do next. Walk away? Leave her to the desert? Or stay, knowing that staying would tangle his fate with hers in a way he hadn't intended? When Ayoka's eyes opened, sharp again, her hand reached for the knife before she even sat up. She realized it had fallen, grasped it quickly, and then glanced toward him. His face gave nothing away. He just nodded once, as if to say he had not touched it. Her suspicion lingered, but her breathing slowed. Matthias rose and stepped outside. The morning was pale, the sun only beginning to burn off the desert chill. He scanned the horizon. The land lay empty, but emptiness was never safe. Tracks could be covered by wind. Raiders or patrols could appear without warning. His gut told him this place was no shelter for long. When he returned, she was tending the fire, coaxing new life into the coals with careful hands. He crouched nearer, watching the flame grow, then broke the silence. "How long you been here?" Her voice came low, her English halting but clearer now than the night before. "Many days, maybe 15. He frowned. 15 days alone, no water source in sight, no supply lines. That meant she had been rationing scraps, risking starvation. "You find food?" he asked. She hesitated, then pointed to a bundle in the corner. Inside were prickly pears, a few dried roots, and strips of rabbit jerky, so thin they looked near useless. It wasn't enough to last another week. He looked at her, then back at the bundle, and understood why her cheeks were hollow, why her arms looked leaner than they should. He thought then of what listeners would wonder. Why had she not fled farther? Why had she stayed hidden in this broken shelter instead of seeking her people? She seemed to hear that question without it being spoken, because her hand went to the leather pouch tied at her dress. She held it tight, as if it anchored her. "My father," she said slowly. "Chief, he say run. Hide. He find me. I wait." Matthias drew in a long breath. Her father had told her to hide, and she had obeyed, holding to his words like scripture. Every day she waited here, believing he might return, even while hunger pressed close. Matthias studied her face, pride carved into every line, but beneath it the faintest trace of fear. He understood it. Holding on to hope was easier than admitting you'd been left behind. "You think he's still coming?" Matthias asked, his tone steady, not mocking. Her eyes flickered toward him. She gave no answer, but the silence was answer enough. By mid-morning, he made his choice. He pulled his coat tighter and said, "There's a spring I passed. Half a day's walk. We'll go." Her head snapped up, suspicion cutting across her face. You won't make it alone," he said simply. "Not out here." She searched his eyes for deceit. When she saw none, she looked down at her dress, tugging the torn seam higher across her chest, as if the thought of traveling beside him made her more aware of her body. Matthias caught the gesture and turned his gaze away, giving her the dignity she fought to keep. They packed in silence. She gathered her beads and dried food. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, adjusted the strap of his worn trail coat. Before they stepped out, she stopped him with a single word. "Why?" He looked at her, his jaw tightening. He could have said nothing. He could have shrugged. Instead, he gave the only answer he had. "Because I know what it's like to lose everyone." The words hung heavy, and though she didn't fully understand them, she seemed to hear the truth in his tone. She nodded once, and for the first time, she stepped past him without the knife raised, trusting him to follow. They walked together across the dry flats, the ridge shrinking behind them. She kept her distance at first, but when the wind rose and the sand stung their faces, she moved closer, her shoulder nearly brushing his. He didn't comment, didn't turn, just matched her pace. By late afternoon, they reached the spring, a shallow pool fed by a trickle from the rocks. Ayoka dropped to her knees, cupping water into her hands, drinking fast, then slowing when she caught him watching. Matthias filled his canteen, passed it to her, and she took it without hesitation this time. As the sun lowered, he built a small fire near the water. She sat across from him, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the flame. She looked tired but steadier than before, her pride intact. He studied her again, not with hunger, but with a kind of respect he had not expected to feel. The questions left from Chapter 1, why she stayed hidden, why she hadn't tried to leave, why she trusted so little, had now been answered. She stayed because she was waiting for her father, because she had been told to, because trust had nearly cost her life before. And Matthias, though he hadn't said it aloud, stayed because leaving her felt like walking away from himself. That night, when the cold pressed in again, she lay close enough that their blankets nearly touched. Neither spoke of it. Neither had to. In the silence, the shape of something new began to form. Fragile, unspoken, but real. The spring gave him water, but it didn't give safety. By dawn, Matthias was awake, sitting against a rock with his rifle across his knees. He had not slept deep, not with open land on every side and no walls to keep strangers out. Ayoka stirred near the fire, her blanket sliding from one shoulder, hair undone from its braid, strands falling loose around her face. She blinked against the early light and then, as always, reached for her knife first. Her fingers found it near her hip, and only then did her breathing settle. Matthias said nothing. He remembered the graves in Texas, how his wife had slept with her hand on their boy's chest just to feel him breathing. She hadn't trusted the night either. Watching Ayoka reminded him of that, how people who had lost too much never truly slept. She crouched beside the spring, rinsing her face, and he noticed the way her dress clung damp against her ribs where the seam had torn. She pulled it tighter, her movements quick, but not before he caught the faint bruises on her collarbone. He hadn't asked about them the night before, though they lingered in his thoughts. Now, with the light showing them clear, he couldn't ignore it. "Those marks," he said flatly. "Men." She froze, her hands still in the water. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her eyes hardened, but she gave the faintest nod. Matthias' jaw tightened. He looked away, biting back anger that had no target anymore. Whoever had done it was gone, yet the evidence stayed on her skin. He wanted to press, to ask when, where, how she had survived, but he stopped himself. Pushing her would do more harm than good. Instead, he said, "No one touches you now. Not while I'm here." Her eyes stayed on him longer than before, searching, as though weighing whether his promise had weight. Then she dipped her hands once more into the water and let silence answer for her. They packed after that, leaving the spring behind. Matthias knew listeners might ask why he didn't simply take her into the nearest town, hand her off to safety. The truth was simple. There was no safety in town for a woman like her. He had seen how settlers looked at Apache women, how quickly they became property or worse. She was the daughter of a chief, whether she admitted it or not, and that meant her presence in the wrong place would be both dangerous and exploited. Keeping her beside him, at least for now, was the only choice that made sense. By midday, they followed a narrow canyon that cut north. The wind eased there, and the rock walls kept the sun from burning them raw. Ayoka walked a pace behind, her knife tucked into her belt, her pouch still tied at her side. Matthias noticed she glanced at him often, not always with suspicion anymore, but with something closer to calculation, like she was trying to decide what kind of man he truly was. When they stopped to rest, she surprised him by speaking first. "Why you here?" Her words stumbled, but her meaning was clear. He thought about lying, about saying he was drifting for work or hunting for land. But lies wasted energy. "I buried my family in Texas," he said, his voice steady low. "Had nothing left. I came west because there was nothing left to keep me there." Her brows drew together, and for the first time, her expression softened with something he hadn't seen, empathy. She touched the leather pouch at her chest. "Me same. Father say hide. I run. Now only beads." For a moment, neither spoke. Just the crackle of dry grass beneath their boots and the faint whistle of the wind through rock. Two people, carrying ghosts that could not be buried deep enough. That evening, when they made camp against the canyon wall, Matthias started a fire. Ayoka sat opposite, her knees drawn close, her eyes reflecting the flame. The torn seam of her dress slipped again as she reached to tie her hair back, revealing more of her chest than she likely intended. Matthias forced his gaze to the fire, his jaw tight. He could feel the pull of desire, the simple hunger of a man too long alone, but he didn't move. He had promised her safety, and his word meant more than any want. She noticed, though. Her eyes lingered on him, curious. She had learned enough of men to know how they looked at her body. His restraint puzzled her, unsettled her even. She studied him in silence, then turned back to the fire, as if filing away the knowledge for later. Before sleep, she asked something he hadn't expected. "You leave tomorrow?" He looked at her, the firelight catching in his stubble and the silver at his temples. "Not unless you tell me to." Her eyes held his a moment longer than they had any other night. Then she nodded once, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and lay down with her back to the fire. Matthias stayed awake a while, watching the embers glow down to red. He realized the questions left from the beginning. Why he hadn't gone to town, why she hadn't left this land, why either of them stayed, were answered in small ways now. Towns offered no safety. Leaving meant surrender. Staying, for both of them, was not a mistake but a choice. And for the first time since his family's graves, Matthias felt that choice might carry him forward instead of back. The canyon narrowed as the sun rose behind them, throwing long shadows against the stone. Matthias kept his rifle slung in his arms, scanning the ridges above. He had not told Ayoka, but he knew the risk of moving through such a place. Raiders favored high ground, and a man alone, or two people looking worn and underfed, were easy prey. His stomach tightened at the thought. He had promised her safety, but promises meant little if steel and lead came down from the cliffs. Ayoka walked a pace behind, as she often did, silent except for the crunch of her moccasins on gravel. She studied the canyon walls with sharp eyes. She wasn't careless. She had lived too long in fear to let her guard drop. What struck Matthias was how her face no longer carried only suspicion when she looked at him. Now there was calculation and something else he could not yet name. They stopped near a curve where boulders had fallen and made natural cover. Matthias set his pack down, pulled out the last of his dried biscuits. He split one in half, passed a piece to her without a word. She took it, chewing slow, and when she finished, she asked something she had not dared until now. "Where you go?" Before me." It was the kind of question a listener would wonder too. Why was Matthias wandering this land at all? He answered without flourish, his tone steady. "I was headed north. Work on ranches, maybe. Didn't matter much where. Just moving." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "No home." He paused, the old ache rising in his chest. He thought of the graves in Texas, the crooked oak tree, the land he had walked away from because he couldn't bear to see it empty. "Had one," he said finally. "Gone now." She looked at him, silent, as if weighing the shape of his pain. Then her gaze fell to the pouch tied at her side. "Same," she whispered. The moment passed without more words, but something shifted. He had given her truth, and she had returned it in kind. By midday, they reached the end of the canyon and came out into open flats. That was when Matthias' instinct stirred. The land ahead carried signs he couldn't ignore. Hoof tracks, wagon ruts, ash from an old campfire. He crouched, pressed his fingers into the dirt. "Menvi been here," he muttered. Ayoka's body tensed. She gripped the knife at her belt, her knuckles whitening. He straightened, scanning the horizon. "Days old," he added, "but we'll move careful." Questions hung in the air. Who were these men, soldiers or drifters, and would they cross paths again? Matthias knew the audience would wonder too, and the answer was clear. Danger wasn't gone. It was close enough to keep them alert. They walked until the sun dipped low, then found shelter near a cluster of rocks. As Matthias gathered wood, Ayoka surprised him by kneeling beside him to help. Her fingers brushed his once as she passed a branch. She didn't pull away as quickly this time. The contact lasted just long enough for his chest to tighten. He didn't speak of it, but he noticed how her eyes lingered on him afterward, thoughtful. When the fire crackled to life, Matthias sat with his back to the rocks, rifle within reach. Ayoka sat across, her face lit by flame. The torn seam of her dress shifted again when she leaned forward, exposing more of her chest than she likely intended. He felt the pull of desire, sharper than before, but he kept his eyes on the fire. He reminded himself of the bruises he had seen on her collarbone, reminders of what other men had done. He would not be one of them. Still, she noticed his restraint. Her gaze rested on him longer than usual, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to ask why. She didn't, but the unspoken question filled the space between them. Later, as the fire burned low, Ayoka pulled her blanket tight and spoke into the silence. "You stay with me? Tomorrow?" Matthias looked at her, surprised by the bluntness of it. She had not asked before, only tested him with suspicion. Now she sought an answer. He met her eyes. "I'll stay as long as you want me to." Her breathing quickened at that, and she turned her face away, but he saw the smallest trace of relief cross her features. They lay down near the fire, closer than the nights before, the distance between their blankets narrower. The questions that lingered from earlier chapters, why he stayed, why she hadn't run when she had the chance, were answered in this moment. She stayed because leaving meant death or worse. He stayed because walking away from her now felt like betraying something more than a promise. As the night deepened, the wind pressed low across the flats, and two broken souls, who had started as strangers in a stolen shelter, lay side by side with the fragile beginning of something stronger than survival. The fire had burned to embers by dawn, and Matthias was already awake, listening. The flats carried sound differently than the canyon. Every gust of wind dragged across the land like a whisper, and every shift of stone echoed too far. He heard hoofbeats before he saw them. Distant, steady, not many but enough. His jaw tightened as he adjusted his rifle strap and crouched at the edge of the rocks. Ayoka stirred behind him, pulling her blanket up. "What?" she asked, voice still rough with sleep. He held up a hand for silence, his eyes narrowing toward the horizon. Dust rose faintly in the early light. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving slow but deliberate. He knew the listeners would wonder who they were, soldiers, drifters, or worse. He didn't have an answer yet, but the way the riders spread themselves across the land told him they weren't friendly. Ayoka crawled forward, her face tense, her hand on her knife. Matthias shook his head. "Stay low," he murmured. She obeyed, crouching beside him, her breath quickening. He could feel her fear in the way her body went rigid, and he wondered who she saw in her mind, soldiers who had raided her camp, or men who had left the bruises on her collarbone. Either way, the threat was real enough. The riders didn't angle toward their camp. They kept to the flats, following the line of the wagon ruts Matthias had spotted the day before. He exhaled slowly, keeping his rifle down. "Not us. Not yet," he said. Ayoka looked at him, her eyes still sharp with fear. "They come back." It wasn't a question. He didn't answer right away. She was right. The land wasn't wide enough to avoid everyone forever. He finally said, "Then we'll be ready." They stayed still until the riders passed out of sight, then packed quickly. Matthias knew one thing had been left hanging from earlier chapters. What was his true mission here? Why was he drifting west if he had no home, no family? Now, as he strapped his rifle across his shoulder and shouldered his pack, the truth pressed on him heavier than ever. He wasn't wandering for land or work. He was running from the silence of Texas, from the graves behind the oak tree. Being with Ayoka had made him face it. He wasn't only surviving, he was searching for a reason not to keep running. By midday, they found cover in a shallow ravine. The air was dry, heat pressing hard against their backs, and their water was running low again. Ayoka sat against the rocks, pulling at the torn seam of her dress. She muttered something in Apache under her breath, then glanced at him. "You know family?" He hesitated, then gave her the words he had avoided before. "Wife. Son." Fever took them. His voice was steady, but inside the ache cut deep. 3 years back. She lowered her eyes, her hand going to the pouch at her chest. She opened it slightly, letting him see for the first time the beads inside, blue and white, worn smooth by years of touch. "Father give. Last thing." Her voice cracked just enough to betray the grief she usually buried. The silence after was heavier than any words. Matthias watched her clutch the pouch, and he realized why she had waited so long in that broken shelter. She wasn't only obeying her father. She was refusing to accept he was gone. "You think he's still alive?" Matthias asked carefully. Her jaw clenched. "I don't know." That honesty was more powerful than certainty. It made him respect her more. She wasn't blind to reality. She was holding on to dignity in the only way left to her. That night, they built a small fire in the ravine. The sky stretched wide and black overhead, stars sharp enough to cut. Ayoka sat close, her blanket sliding down as she leaned toward the warmth. The neckline of her dress had torn further during the day, exposing more of her chest than she could hide. She caught his eyes on her and froze, as if waiting for him to look at her like every other man had. But Matthias only looked away, stoking the fire instead. "Cold's worse tonight," he said, his tone even. She studied him, her gaze steady and long. "You not same," she said at last. He looked at her, unsure what she meant. "You see, but you no take." The words landed between them heavy. He didn't reply. Instead, when the fire sank low, he pulled off his coat and laid it beside her. "Take it," he said. She hesitated, then slipped it around her shoulders. Her body softened, her breathing steadied. For the first time, she lay down with her back not to the fire, but facing him. Their eyes met once in the dim light, and the distance between them no longer felt like a wall. The unanswered questions from earlier, why he restrained himself, why she had started to trust him, why either of them hadn't broken the fragile bond, were now clearer. He restrained himself because his promise to protect meant more than his desire. She began to trust because he had shown her restraint, a rare thing in her world. And they hadn't broken the bond because both of them, scarred and weary, were beginning to need what the other gave, the choice to stay. Sleep came slow. The night was quiet but heavy, the sound of her breathing near enough to remind Matthias he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, he felt that might be enough to keep him from running. The night in the ravine had passed without interruption, but when the sun rose, Matthias felt the kind of weight in his chest that only came before trouble. He sat with his rifle balanced across his knees, eyes sweeping the ridge lines above. The hoofbeats from a morning before hadn't left his mind. He knew the desert well enough to understand men didn't travel aimlessly across it. They were following trails, or hunting, or looking for something to claim. And two people alone, with little food and no protection, made easy prey. Ayoka stirred beside the dying fire, the coat he had given her still draped around her shoulders. Her hair had come loose during the night, framing her face in black strands that caught the light. She rubbed her eyes, then reached for her knife by instinct, only relaxing when she saw him still there. The tension in her shoulders eased, but her gaze stayed on him longer than usual, as though testing whether he was truly still by choice and not just circumstance. They ate little that morning, half a biscuit each, water sipped sparingly from his canteen. Hunger was beginning to set in, and Matthias could feel the wear of it in his arms and legs. He wondered how long she had gone before he found her with no food at all. That question, he realized, was one listeners might still hold. How had she survived alone for so long before he stumbled into her shelter? She gave him the answer without prompting. As they walked out of the ravine, following a faint trail north, she spoke in halting English, her words broken but clear. "I hide, dig roots, catch rabbit." Sometimes she paused, her throat tightening. "Sometimes men come. I run." The bruises he had seen before made more sense now. He didn't press her, but the picture sharpened. She had not been living in that shelter as a home. It had been nothing but a stopgap, a place to wait, a place where every sound outside kept her hand on her knife. He thought about his own nights since Texas, the way silence had pressed too loud in an empty house. Both of them had been surviving, not living. By midday, the land flattened again, the sun high and relentless. They stopped in the shadow of a low outcrop. Matthias crouched to check the horizon while Ayoka rested against the stone. That was when he saw it, dust rising to the south, faint but distinct. He counted the seconds between gusts of wind. No mistake. Riders. His stomach tightened. They're coming. Ayoka stiffened, clutching her pouch, her knife already in her hand. Soldiers? She asked. Could be, he said. Could be worse. He weighed his choices quickly. They could run, but the flats offered little cover. They could stay hidden, but the outcrop wouldn't conceal them long if the riders passed close. He looked at her, then at the rocks behind. We'll make our stand here if we have to. Her breath hitched, but she nodded. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also the resolve. She had lived too long in flight. Maybe she was ready, finally, not to run. The riders drew closer. 3 men, rough-looking, their horses thin and restless. Not soldiers, Matthias realized. Drifters. Armed, hungry, the kind who took what they wanted. His finger flexed against the stock of his rifle. They pulled up 20 yards away, dust circling their boots as they dismounted. One spat into the dirt, his eyes finding Ayoka first. Matthias saw it, the way their gazes stuck to her torn dress, the neckline that had slipped too low. Heat surged through him, his jaw locking. What you got there, cowboy? One of them sneered. Little Apache prize? Matthias leveled his rifle. She's not yours, he said. The man laughed, spreading his arms mockingly. Ain't yours either, by the looks of it. You really want to die for her? Matthias' finger tightened on the trigger. His heart hammered, not from fear but from a knowledge of what was at stake. This wasn't only about surviving. It was about proving his word meant something. That when he told her no one would touch her, he had meant it. The standoff stretched, heat buzzing in the air. Then one of the drifters shifted his hand toward his revolver. Matthias fired first. The shot cracked, echoing across the flats, and the man dropped where he stood. The other 2 moved quick, one drawing his pistol, the other rushing forward. Matthias chambered another round, but the rushing man was too close. Ayoka stepped in, her knife flashing, slashing across the man's arm. He howled, stumbling back. Matthias swung the butt of his rifle, striking him hard across the jaw, sending him to the dirt. The third man fired, the shot whistling past Matthias' shoulder, but Matthias turned and fired back. The drifter fell. Silence crashed down after the gunfire, broken only by the groans of the man on the ground. Matthias stepped forward, rifle raised. Go, he said coldly. The wounded drifter scrambled to his horse, clutching his bleeding arm, and fled across the flats without looking back. Matthias lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving. He turned, finding Ayoka standing still, her knife in her hand, blood smeared along the blade. She was breathing fast, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wide. You did good, he said, his voice low. She shook her head, looking down at her hands. I kill. No, he said firmly. He'll live. You saved us. Her shoulders trembled, but when she looked at him again, something new flickered in her eyes. Not just fear, not just relief, but trust. He had stood his ground for her. She had stood her ground with him. As evening fell, they moved on, leaving the bodies behind. They camped in a hollow, the fire small and hidden. Ayoka sat across from him, the flames catching on her face. She studied him quietly, then spoke. Why you stay? Could leave. Could run. Why me? He met her eyes, no hesitation this time. Because you matter, he said. Her lips parted, but no words came. She only looked at him, her eyes softening. And in that moment, the answer to every unspoken question from the first night became clear. He stayed not out of duty, not out of pity, but because he chose to, and she finally believed it. That night, when they lay near the fire, she did not turn her back. She faced him, close enough that her breath touched his cheek. Neither spoke, neither reached out, but the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of something neither had dared hope for. The night after the fight with the drifters was heavy with silence. Not the uneasy silence of strangers, but the kind that followed bloodshed and survival. Matthias kept his rifle close, leaning against the rocks while the fire sank to embers. Across from him, Ayoka sat wrapped in his coat, her braid undone, her eyes fixed on the flames. She hadn't spoken since the men fled, but her knife was still in her lap, the blade smeared faintly with blood she hadn't yet cleaned away. He knew what she was thinking. He had seen that look before, years ago, in soldiers who had taken a life for the first time. She hadn't killed the man, not outright, but she had cut him deep enough to leave her hand shaking. He decided not to force her into words. Some things were better carried until the weight settled on its own. Instead, he spoke low, breaking the quiet in a way that didn't demand an answer. You did what you had to. That's the only reason we're here now. Her eyes lifted, catching his. She searched his face as if waiting for judgment. When none came, her shoulders loosened, though only slightly. She set the knife aside and drew the coat tighter around her. By dawn, when the wind swept cool across the flats, Matthias knew they had to keep moving. The drifters' camp couldn't have been far, and men had a way of coming back when they lost something. He packed their meager supplies, slung his rifle, and nodded for her to follow. She did, silent but close, her eyes darting often toward him as though measuring the space he gave her, the promise he had made. They walked until the sun sat high. The desert seemed endless, dry air pulling sweat and strength from their bodies. At a dry wash they stopped, and Matthias crouched to check the ground. Hoof tracks again, fainter this time, days old, heading west. He said nothing at first, but Ayoka crouched beside him, her hand brushing the dirt, her gaze sharp. More men, she said quietly. Yeah, he answered, but not close. The question that had hung since the start returned then. Were they really going? Was he just wandering, or did he have a plan? He realized she deserved more than silence now. As they rested in the shade of the wash, he told her plain. I was headed north. Thought maybe I'd find work. Ranch, stock work. Truth is, I didn't much care where. I wasn't looking for a place, just moving so I wouldn't stop. Her eyes stayed on him, steady. And now? He met her gaze. Now I care what happens to you. The words hung heavy between them, and he saw her breathing quicken. She looked down at her hands, then at the pouch tied at her side. Her fingers opened it just enough for him to glimpse the beads again. My father, if he live, he find me. But maybe he not. Her voice cracked on the last words, the first time she had admitted the doubt aloud. Matthias shifted closer, not touching her, just making his presence solid. If he doesn't, you're not alone. Not anymore. Her eyes lifted slowly, searching his face. She didn't answer, but her silence was no longer rejection. It was consideration. That evening, they camped in a shallow hollow sheltered by mesquite. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the hard lines fear had carved into her. She sat close enough that her knee brushed his when she shifted, but she didn't pull away. When she leaned forward to feed the fire, the torn seam of her dress slipped lower again. He caught the sight of her cleavage in the glow, but this time he didn't turn away immediately. He let his eyes rest on her for a breath, then raised them back to her face. She noticed. Her lips parted, her breath caught. For a long moment, neither moved. The air between them grew tight, charged. Finally, she spoke in a whisper that carried more courage than her knife ever had. Why you look but not take? His jaw worked as he searched for the right words. Because you deserve more than being taken. Her eyes widened, glimmering in the firelight. No man had said such a thing to her before. Slowly, she reached across the narrow space and touched his hand. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't pull back. Matthias didn't move at first. His heart hammered, the old grief rising against the new pull he felt toward her. He thought of his wife, of the grave he had left behind. Was he betraying her by letting this happen? Or was he finally choosing life again? He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with Ayoka's. She drew in a sharp breath, but her grip tightened. When he shifted closer, their knees touched fully. He raised his other hand, brushing a strand of loose hair from her face. She didn't flinch. Her eyes closed slowly, her lips parting. The first kiss came hesitant, his lips barely brushing hers. She froze for a heartbeat, then leaned into it, her hand pressing against his chest. The warmth of her body through the torn fabric of her dress sent a surge through him, but he held back, letting the kiss stay soft, steady. When he pulled back, her eyes opened, wide and searching. She whispered, almost afraid of the answer. You stay. He met her gaze without wavering. I stay. She exhaled shakily, as if a weight had lifted she had carried for too long. She leaned against him then, her head resting on his shoulder. The firelight glowed over them both, and for the first time since either of them had spoken of their losses, the silence between them wasn't filled with ghosts. It was filled with something new, fragile but real. That night they slept side by side, her hand still gripping his even as she drifted into rest. For Matthias, it was the first night in years that he did not wake in the dark searching for what he had lost. For Ayoka, it was the first night she didn't hold her knife in her sleep. The questions that had lingered, why he restrained himself, whether she could ever let herself trust a man again, whether either of them could imagine more than survival, were answered without needing further words. He had shown restraint because his care was real. She had let herself touch him because she saw he was different. And both had taken the first step towards something more than survival, the choice to belong to each other. Morning broke over the hollow, soft light spilling across the sand and rock. Matthias stirred first, the years of living on edge waking him before the sun was fully risen. Ayoka still slept against his side, her hand resting lightly on his chest where she had left it the night before. For a long while he didn't move, listening to her steady breathing, letting himself feel something he hadn't in years: peace. The old ache of loss was still there, but it didn't hollow him out the way it once had. It was tempered now by the weight of her presence, the warmth of her body, the knowledge that someone had chosen to stay close when they could have turned away. He eased himself up carefully, not wanting to wake her, and checked the horizon. The land lay quiet, no riders, no dust trails. The threat that had haunted them for days seemed distant, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He gathered what little remained of their supplies, then crouched near the stream of firelight where she still lay wrapped in his coat. For the first time, he let himself truly study her face without fear of disrespect. Even with her hair tangled, her dress torn, and exhaustion etched into her features, she carried dignity. She wasn't a woman to be pitied, not a burden. She was the only reason he hadn't kept walking into silence. When she woke, her eyes met his immediately. The suspicion that had marked her gaze since the night he found her was gone. Instead, there was the steady calm of someone who had made a choice. She sat up slowly, brushing the hair from her face, and reached for her pouch. She opened it in front of him this time, letting the beads spill into her palm. Blue and white, smooth by years of touch, they were all that remained of her father's gift. She held them out for him to see. "My father," she said softly, "he give before soldiers come. I'll wait for him, but maybe he not come." Her voice trembled on the last words, the first time she had allowed herself to let go of that hope. Matthias nodded, his throat tight. "Then you don't have to wait anymore." "Not alone." Her eyes searched his, and she gave the smallest nod. She closed the pouch, tied it back to her dress, and in that gesture he saw her past honored but not chained. She had carried the weight long enough. They broke camp and moved north, keeping to low ground where brush gave them cover. Matthias felt her walking closer now, her steps nearly in rhythm with his. She wasn't following out of fear anymore. She was walking beside him by choice. Listeners might have wondered through the story if she would ever see him as more than a stranger who stumbled into her shelter. By now, the answer was clear. She saw him as the man who had stayed when no one else had. By midday, they found the outline of an old cabin, half collapsed but still standing against the rise of a ridge. The wood was weathered gray, the door hanging from one hinge, but to Matthias it looked like more than shelter. It looked like a place they could claim. Ayoka stood beside him, her hand brushing his arm. "Here," she asked. He studied the roofline, the way the stone chimney still held. It would take work, but work was what he knew. He nodded. "Here." They spent the afternoon clearing the inside. He lifted the broken door, fitted it back into place, while she swept out dirt and old straw with branches. He split wood from the pile out back, hands steady on the axe, and when he carried the first load inside, he found her patching a gap in the wall with strips of cloth from her own dress. He stopped, watching her for a moment, the quiet determination in her movements. She looked up, met his eyes, and for the first time she smiled, small, cautious, but real. That evening they sat inside their rebuilt walls, a fire flickering in the hearth. Ayoka's hair had come loose entirely, falling over her shoulders, and she had wrapped his coat around herself against the draft. She looked at him across the fire, then moved closer, sitting beside him instead of across. Her hand found his again, fingers lacing with his, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. He drew a long breath, steadying himself. The questions that might have lingered since the first chapter. Would he ever let go of the grief from Texas? Would she ever see herself as more than abandoned? Would either of them stay when leaving was always easier? Were answered here, in the quiet of the firelight. He felt it in the way her hand gripped his, in the way her body rested against his without fear. She lifted her head after a while, her lips close to his ear. "You say you stay," she whispered. "Still true." He turned, his eyes meeting hers in the glow. Still true. Her lips brushed his then, not hesitant like before, but sure. He kissed her back, his hand cradling her face, the warmth of her skin soft beneath his rough palm. The kiss deepened, slow and steady, carrying all the weight of what they had survived. When it broke, she stayed close, her forehead against his. "You mind now?" she asked softly, her English halting but her meaning plain. He nodded. "Yours. And you're mine." The fire burned low, but neither of them noticed. For the first time since soldiers had scattered her people, since fever had taken his family, both of them felt what had been missing: belonging. Not forced, not begged for, but chosen. In the days that followed, they worked side by side. He rebuilt the chimney while she stitched patches for the roof. He hunted small game, and she cooked it, flavoring it with herbs she gathered along the ridge. Every evening they returned to the fire together, and every night they lay close, no longer strangers, no longer broken halves. By the time winter winds began to cut across the flats, the cabin stood strong again, smoke curling from its chimney. Anyone passing might have thought it was just another lonely homestead, one of many scattered across the borderlands. But inside it was more. It was proof that even in a land that tore families apart, two people could find each other, stay, and build something whole again. The story ended not with flight, not with loss, but with the quiet truth of their choice. Matthias stayed. Ayoka stayed. And together, they began the life neither thought they would live to see.